ناسوک نشته دی. No recording हो गई तस बासी में upload कभी ये record की शुरू की कम हाँ. So today we start up with a demand, supply and equilibrium. I'll be giving you an overview of the demand and supply and equilibrium. In my previous lecture, I have already explained demand, what is supply, what is equilibrium. Now let's go in a bit detail. First thing which I'm going to discuss is the individual's demand for a commodity. Now, individual demand for a commodity basically means the quantity of a commodity that an individual is willing to purchase over a specific period of time is a function of or depend on the price of the commodity, his money income, and the prices of other commodities, and his taste. By changing the prices of the commodity under consideration while keeping by changing the prices of the commodity under consideration while keeping constant the individual's money income. Remember one thing, individual's money income, his taste, and the prices of other commodities. That is, we have discussed what is other things remaining the same. Here we make an assumption, which is strictly speaking known as a ceteris paribus, the assumption of ceteris paribus. We get the individual's demand schedule for a commodity. Now, this demand schedule for a commodity can also be represented by a demand schedule. And when demand schedule is shown graphically, it is known as a demand curve. What is a demand schedule? Demand schedule basically is a relationship between the price and quantity, while other things remaining the same, which I have already discussed. What are those other things? Keeping constant the individual money income, his taste, and the prices of other commodities. That is, we make an assumption, other things remaining the same, or ceteris paribus. Suppose that an individual demand function for a commodity X. We want to draw an individual demand function for a commodity X. And we write it in an equation form, capital DQ dx, that is quantity of dx equals 8 minus p subscript x. To repeat, for a commodity X is Q dx, which is equal to 8 minus px ceteris paribus. Now, how do we derive a demand schedule from here? By substituting various prices of X into the demand equation, which has been already given to you. That is Q dx is equal to 8 minus px ceteris paribus. So we substitute the prices in this demand function. So we get a demand schedule. Now demand schedule, as I said before, it can be represented in a tabular form, both in a horizontal form or a vertical form, with the prices of X in rupees and quantity of commodity dx. Like if we substitute the different prices in this demand equation, we get on one axis, we get prices of X. If it is a foreign book, then it will be a dollar in pounds. And if it is a Pakistani book, then it will be given in rupees. So we get a demand schedule, prices of X and of quantity demanded X. Now, by plotting each pair of the value as a point, to repeat, now by plotting each pair of values as a point on a graph and joining the resulting point, we get the individual's demand curve for commodity X. Now, the shape of the demand curve is always a downward sloping curve. which never touches x-axis. But in some cases, we draw it as a straight line that is under certain assumptions. So a demand curve is a curve which slopes downward toward x-axis, but it never touches x-axis. Maybe someone asks you that sometime we draw a demand curve as a straight line. Now, the straight line shape of the demand curve is under certain situations. For example, the demand curve of the figure, that is when we plot the demand schedule, we get a figure, shows that a particular point at time, if the price of X is say rupees 7, the individual is willing to purchase 1 unit of X over the period of time specified. To repeat, when we depict, when we show the demand schedule in a form of a figure, we get a demand curve. And what does a demand curve shows? The demand curve basically shows that at a particular point in time, if the price of X, let's suppose, is rupees 7, the individual is willing to purchase 1 unit of X over the period of time specified. Clear so far? If the price of X is say rupees 6, let's say the price of is 6, what we do is, if the price of X is 6, the individual is willing to purchase 2 units of X over a specified period of time and so on. Thus, the points on the demand curve represents alternative as seen by the individual at a particular period of time. To repeat in short, basically it means that a demand curve is a graphic representation of a demand schedule, and a demand schedule shows us the relationship between the price and quantity. When those price and quantity are shown on two-dimensional diagram, that is prices on y-axis and quantity on x-axis, when we join these points at different level of prices and at a different level of quantities, we get a curve, and that curve is known as a demand curve. Now, the demand curve specifies a law, and the law of demand curve, law says that the demand curve is always negatively sloped. Now, the law of negatively sloped demand, what does this mean? It basically means lower the price of X, the greater the quantity of X demanded by the individual. Lower the price of X, the greater the quantity of X demanded by the individual. This inverse relationship between price and quantity is reflected in a negative slope of the demand curve. Demand curve slopes negatively for a simple reason. It has got a negative slope because it has got a negative relationship between price and quantity, other things remaining the same. That is, if the price is more, less will be demanded. If the price is less, more may be demanded. With the exception of very rare cases, the demand curve always slopes downward. As I've said before also, that in very exceptional cases, it slopes downward, but sometimes we draw it as a straight line. That drawing of a straight line demand is basically under certain exceptional conditions, which will be discussed later on. And this indicates that the price of a commodity fall, more of it is purchased. That is usually referred to as a law of negatively sloped demand curve, which basically means other things remaining the same, the law of demand specifies a negative relationship between price and quantity. Now, the demand curve, which is negatively sloped, as I said before, I'm repeatedly again saying that sometimes it is drawn as a straight line. Maybe somebody asks you that why always it is, you say that it is a negatively sloped curve which never touch x-axis, but sometimes it touches axis. It is only under very exceptional cases, maybe inferior good, superior good, normal good, and etc., etc. Now, demand curve have got certain shifts. Now, the shifts in the individual demand curve can be specified as when any of the ceteris paribus condition changes, when any of the other things remain changes. That is, we say other things remaining the same. That is the condition of ceteris paribus. When any of the ceteris paribus condition changes, the entire demand curve shifts. Now, this is referred to as a change in demand as opposed to change in quantity demanded, which is a movement along the same demand curve. Now, here we have got two technical points. One is change in demand, one is shifts in demand. Shift in demand basically means that you try to move along the same demand curve. And the change in the demand means that the demand may be increasing or decreasing. Now, this is an individual demand curve. When we do the summation of the individual demand curves, we get a market demand for a commodity. Now, how would you say what is the market demand for a commodity? The market or aggregate demand for a commodity gives the alternative amounts of the commodity demanded per time period at various alternative prices. As I said before also, this has already been explained. It does not need any further explanation by all the individual in the market. The market demand for a commodity thus depends. What are the factors on which the market demand depends? Can anyone tell us? No, right, I'll tell you. The market demand for a commodity thus depends on all the factors that determine the individual demand, and in addition on a number of buyers of the commodity in the market. Geometrically, the market demand curve for a commodity is obtained by the horizontal, not by the vertical, by the horizontal summation of all the individual demand curves, excuse me, for the commodity. I'll repeat this again. A market demand for a commodity thus depends on all the factors that determines the individual demand, and in addition on the number of buyers of the commodity in the market. Geometrically, that is diagrammatically, the market demand curve for a commodity is obtained by the horizontal summation of the individual demand curve for the commodity. Now, so far clear? Now, when you do the horizontal summation, you get a simple demand curve, and that demand curve is just the summation of the different individual demand curve, maybe individual 1, individual 2, individual 3. When we add up all together, all these prices and the demands of a commodity by the different individuals, when we do the summation, when we do the total of it, we get a new curve, and that new curve is known as a individual demand curve. On the other side, as I said before, that I'll be also explaining the supply, but I'll be doing it very briefly because you know what is a demand and what is a supply. A single producer supply of a commodity. Maybe somebody says, what is a single producer's supply of a commodity? Now let me explain it. The quantity of a commodity that a single producer, to repeat, the quantity of a commodity that a single producer is willing to sell. Demand, that is willing to purchase. Willing to purchase. Supply, willing to sell over a specific period of time is a function of, or depends on the price of the commodity and the producer cost of production. So in one case, it is the supply of a commodity. On the other side, demand is the commodity which is demanded by the individual over a specific period of time at different prices. So in order to get producer supply schedule and supply curve of a commodity, there are factors. And what are those factors which influences cost of production must be held constant. By held constant, I mean that they should be ceteris paribus. But ceteris paribus, again and again, I'm saying ceteris paribus, other things remaining constant. It is one and the same thing. And what are those other things remaining the same? These are technology, the supply of input necessary to produce the commodity, and for agricultural commodities. Now, this is generally for the commodity. Now, if somebody asks you what will be the factors for the agricultural commodity, now agricultural commodity basically depends upon the climate and the weather condition. By keeping all the above factor constant while changing the prices of the commodity, we will get the individual producer supply schedule and a supply curve. Now, when the producer supply curve is being, what we say is being, let me tell you, when it is being diagrammatically represented, it is known as a producer supply curve. Clear so far? Now, what we do is, now what should be the shape of the supply curve? As I said, the shape of the demand curve is a negatively sloped. The shape of the supply curve means that when lower the price of X, smaller the quantity of X will be offered by the supplier. The reverse is, of course, also true. That is, smaller the quantities supplied, higher the price, lower the price. Higher the price, larger the quantity will be offered for sale by the supplier. The reverse is, of course, also true. This direct relationship between price and quantity is reflected by the positive slope of the supply curve. Positive slope of the supply curve means that on x-axis you take up the price of X, on x-axis, sorry, you take the quantity of X, and on y-axis you take the prices of X's. And when you plot the diagram, you join the points, you plot the diagram, it is an upward sloping curve. However, while in the case of the demand curve, we could talk about the law of negatively sloped demand, as I said before also. In the case of the supply curve, we cannot talk of the law of negatively sloped supply. In the demand curve, negatively sloped. In the supply curve, no, it is not negatively sloped. Even though the supply curve is usually positively sloped, it could have also a zero. It could have also a zero. In other words, infinite or even negative slope, and no generalization are possible for this case. There is no generalization. That is, we may be getting the negative zero or infinite or the negative slope, but there is no law which governs it, no generalization. Now, similar to the shift in the demand curve, there is also shifts in the single producer supply curve. What does this basically mean? When the factors that we kept constant is defining the supply schedule and a supply curve, other things remaining the same, changes the entire supply curve shifts. This is referred to as a change or shift in the supply and must be clearly distinguished from the change in the quantity supplied. As I said before, also the change in the quantity demanded is the movement along the same demand curve. So similarly, change in the quantity supplied is said to be the movement on the same supply curve. More or less the same procedure can be applied in order to derive the market supply of a commodity. Market supply of a commodity basically is the summation of the different supplier, that is supplier A, supplier B, supplier C. When we add that together, we get a combination, a total of it. And that total is known as a market supply curve. Then in this chapter, I said that I'll be also explaining the equilibrium. As before, I have explained, equilibrium is basically interaction, a point of settlement between the forces of the economics. What are those forces? Forces are the demand and supply. So wherever the force of supply and demand intersect each other, we get the equilibrium. So now I'll explain it clearly. Equilibrium refers to the market condition which once achieved tend to persist. That is, it tends to persist. It should be stable. It should be there. There should be no movement. In economics, this occurs when the quantity of the commodity demanded in the market, that is, in economics, this occurs when the quantity of a commodity demanded in the market per unit of time equals the quantity of commodity supplied to the market over the same time period. It looks a bit difficult for you. You can write it now. I'll go very slow again and give you the point. What is an equilibrium? Equilibrium basically is a point of settlement, between the forces of economics, and the two basic forces of economics are said to be the demand and supply. Wherever the demand and supply each other and it persists, there is no change, no upward shift, no downward shift. I've already explained this in the class on the board also. So then we say it is an equilibrium. So strictly speaking, equilibrium refers to the market condition which once achieved tends to persist. Clear so far? In economics, this occurs when the quantity of the commodity demanded in the market per unit of time equals, that is, they are equal to the quantity of the commodity supplied in the market over the same period of time. This is verbal definition. So how about the geometric representation? So geometrically, equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the commodities market demand curve and the market supply curve. That, as I said before, where the market demand curve and the market supply curve, that is the two forces, intersect each other and it persists, then we say it is an equilibrium situation. The price and quantity at which equilibrium exists are known respectively as the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. Clear so far? Are there any questions? If there are any questions, please do ask. So far what I have explained in very brief the demand, supply, and the equilibrium. Demand, basically, to summarize, demand is said to be the quantity which is demanded at a particular price, but with a strict assumption that is other things remaining the same. While supply means any commodity which is supplied by the market, by the supplier in the market at a given price. Supply curve can be positive and negative, while the demand curve is always negative. Negatively sloped demand curve, we say curve, but sometimes you see that we draw it as a straight line. Now the straight line drawing of the demand is basically under certain condition, under very strict conditions. Otherwise, it is a curve which never slopes downward, but which never touches x-axis. Now, the change in the demand curve basically means the shifts in the demand curve, either upward shift or downward shift. Or the movement on the demand curve means that there are no shift, but you move on the demand curve either upward or downward by changing the price and quantity demand. Similar is the situation of the supply. Now, whenever these two forces of the demand and supply intersect each other, we get a position, and that position is known as an equilibrium, and most generally it is being labeled as E. And this equilibrium position is generally persist for a longer period of time. If there is a change in the equilibrium, it means there are changes in the price and quantity, or there is a change in the price and quantity on the supply side. So the shift may be either upward shift or either it may be a downward shift. Now, the summation, as I said before, the total market demand curve is being derived by the total, by the summation of the different individuals, say individual 1 demand curve, individual 2 demand curve, individual 3 demand curve. When we total these demand, we get another demand curve, and that is known as a market demand. Similar is the situation with the supply. That is the supply of one supply plus the supply provided by the second, provided by the third. When it has been totaled, when it has been summed together, when it has been added, we get a single supply curve, and that supply is known as a is known as a market supply curve. Clear so far? Anything to be asked? Anything to be clarified? Now, from where you are going to read it, you can read it from any good book. You can go to the net. You can read it from any other good book. The book which is simpler, which is I'm saying again and again, basically I'm using the book of Dominic Salvatore, The Microeconomic Theory. You can use that book, but that book may be simpler for me, but may be difficult for you. So for that simple reason, you can read any other book which is understandable to you. This is an overview of the demand, supply, and equilibrium. If anybody asks you about the law of demand, the law of demand basically is negatively sloped. Why? Because it says other things remaining the same. Other things remaining the same basically means ceteris paribus. That is, other things remaining the same. What are those other things? Taste, fashion, weather, any other factor. When those factors remains the same, and the relationship between an price and quantity is shown. The price, when the price is high, the individual will not be willing to buy more commodity. When the price falls, the individual will buy more commodity, but with the condition of ceteris paribus, with the condition of other things remaining the same. You may be asking me a question that sometime even the price is high, but even then we purchase a commodity. Like we purchase plover, while we purchase coat, while we purchase a trouser or something like that. But that basically is the violation of the condition of other things remaining the same. Looking at the fashion, we try to purchase it. For example, in summers, we do not purchase generally, I'm saying generally, we do not purchase summer products, winter products. Why? The reason is that we do not know that whether it will be fashion in the next season or not. But sometime we purchase it. That is, we try to violate the law of ceteris paribus, the law of other things remaining the same. Clear so far? Now, you go through it. If there are any questions, you can ask me in my next lecture also. Clear? Please try to distribute these amongst your other friends also, if possible to you. Thank you very much. पूरा योर चैप्टर में वाला खत्म हो और खासियों को रही चे रिकॉर्डिंग में समझो बस ठीक शो बस नेक्स्ट सैटरडे बस उनका कहीं वाले और वर्तमान में ये मैं कोशिश करता है सिमुलेशन बस स्टूडेंट्स के टैक्सी ये पाया सच्चे साथ में study कवरेज पता सामने का ओवरलोड और बस ला